Thank you for coming to the Center for International Studies Starr Forum featuring war journalist Anna Badkhen on her most recent book, Piecemeals. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that we have several more events happening this fall. A schedule can be found on the back table as well as a sign-up sheet should you be interested in getting emails from us. For today's event, we will do this conversation style between Anna Badkhen and Fotini Christia, followed by a Q&A session. Also, we will be videotaping this event, so please, during the Q&A, use the mics here so we can capture your questions. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, Fotini Christia is Assistant Professor in Political Science at MIT. She recently completed her PhD in Public Policy at Harvard University, where she was a recipient of research fellowships from the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, the Olin Institute for Strategic Studies, and the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. She has published work on the role of local elites and civil societies and is presently working on two projects, one in Afghanistan and one in Bosnia, that address the effects of institutions of cooperation in post-conflict multi-ethnic societies. She has also worked in the Middle East and Central Asia and has written opinion pieces on her experiences from Afghanistan, Iran, the West Bank, Gaza, Uzbekistan for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. Anna Badkhen has covered wars in Afghanistan, Somalia, Israel, and the Palestinian territories, Chechnya and Kashmir. She has reported extensively from Iraq since 2003, and her reporting has appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle, the Boston Globe, the Christian Science Monitor, the National, Frontline, World, Truthdig, and Salon. She also has a new book coming out, A War Reporter's Pantry, which will be published in January 2011 by Free Press, Simon&Schuster. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
I think Anna will get us started with a little bit of a story on the book before we get it going with the conversation. But I trust the War Reporter's Pantry was the former title?
That
before?
Was the working title.
So one book.
One book, yes, just came out, and here it is, Piecemeals.
Who thought of this title?
Well, if you want to know the full story, a colleague of mine, a photojournalist, thought of the title. He said, "War Reporter's Panties, what?" So, you know, it had to go, and Piecemeals, yeah. So I owe it to Jason Eskenazi, who's in Turkey right now.
That's great. So I think you told me you were going to get us started with a story on food in Afghanistan.
I was actually going to start us with a story in Afghanistan, but first of all, thank you for coming. Thank you for eating, because I think having a communal meal, even though I can't eat and talk, you will excuse me for not eating, but please eat, so that we can pretend that we are sharing a meal together. I wanted to start with two stories I saw in the New York Times on Sunday. I don't know how you guys get it. You probably are all at MIT getting it on your iPads. I'm very much a dinosaur. I still believe in cutting down trees for publication. You know, 2 books per tree. And then I bike it off, thinking that somehow compensates. And I did have a Kindle for a couple of days until I was told to give it away because I thought it was a coaster. Anyway, so I get the Times in this very antiquated paper format, which is why it was possible for me to see the Week in Review section first, specifically Dexter Filkin's piece about Afghanistan and the U.S. exit strategy. One part of the strategy is co-opting Taliban leaders, the way the United States did in Iraq with about 100,000 Iraqi insurgents in 2007-2008. In Iraq, these reformed insurgents were banded together into the so-called awakening councils. Then I pulled out the front page, and the lead story was about how hundreds of members of these awakening councils woke up and said, wait a second, what are we doing here? We're insurgents. This isn't right, and are now defecting by the hundreds and rejoining al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. Except now they're better trained, and they understand how coalition forces and Iraqi troops operate, which in this light, hoping that the same policy will suddenly work in Afghanistan, where switching sides is almost a national sport, just ask General Dostum, sounds pretty myopic, but here's a thought. It is possible that the way we think about the future of the conflict in Afghanistan is myopic as a whole. Because what kind of future are we talking about? Are we talking about defeating the Taliban? Are we talking about making Afghanistan safe enough so that we can say, okay, we can go home now? Or are we talking about the larger picture, a future of a nation that supplies most of the world's opium, a nation that has the second highest child mortality rate in the world, a nation that has known no peace pretty much since the beginning of recorded history? Consider this. The United States went to war in Afghanistan 9 years ago, but the American war against the Taliban is only the latest iteration in a succession of invasions, fratricides, and genocides that have washed over the mountains and plateaus of Afghanistan almost incessantly for centuries. What to us seems like the forever war, to Afghans is just the latest in a long progression of blows to which there seems to be no end. The Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert wrote this about war. A convoy of steel quiffs, boys painted with chalk, aluminum filings bring down houses, deafening missiles are sent into completely crimson air. No one flies off into the sky. The earth attracts bodies and lead. This is the generic, though beautifully and hauntingly captured image of war that stares at us from the front pages of newspapers and from television screens. Note how it has no human faces in it. There are only masks, those chalk-painted boys, and bodies. Masks and bodies, and American mothers weeping over their dead children here in the States, and young men and women in uniform with eyes hollowed out by combat trauma. That's how most of us see war. But imagine, 28 million Afghans live and die almost violently in the land where American troops fight. Who are these people, these strangers, stenciled against the cauterized plains and glaciated mountains of Afghanistan? These tiny cardboard cutouts against the distant Central Asian battlefield. These nameless stick figures without substance or shadow. What do they want? Some people say outsiders don't understand Afghanistan. Perhaps this is because to the world, most Afghans are voiceless. Think about it, 2/3 of Afghans over 15 cannot read or write. Much of the country is believed to be too dangerous, and so dangerous that few Westerners, few Western reporters, except Fotini here, venture into the outer provinces without the armed escort of NATO troops. That vantage point provides excellent and heartbreaking insight into the momentous dilemmas facing NATO soldiers, but it doesn't afford a quiet, intimate, long look into an Afghan living room. If we're trying to achieve anything in Afghanistan, we should start by sitting down in that living room and breaking bread. We should start by listening. Barry Lopez said once, everything is held together with stories. That is all that's holding us together, stories and compassion. I'm a storyteller. I tell stories of people who rarely get heard, people who live in parts of the world where few reporters go because it's difficult or dangerous or not expedient, or because the stories are hard to fit into cut-and-dried, made-for-TV snippets. I tell stories from their dinner tables or dastarkhans stretched over earthen floors, as it were. These stories are important. In the land we are used to seeing through the gun sights of Americans, 28 million people just outside the limelight of our attention span raise crops, graze sheep, cuddle their children, cook fragrant bread. They fall in and out of love. They quarrel. They go to sleep hungry. They picnic on holidays. They dispatch their preteen sons to haul cement to augment meager family earnings. Wars roll over their land like waves of wheat. The wind gusts drive across their valleys, and amid that violence, somehow, they persevere. The hopes, the dreams, the animosities of a wheat farmer from Balkh or a refugee from Kunduz may not seem significant, but they are. Because when push comes to shove, they will throw their weight and maybe even the barrel of their antiquated Kalashnikovs, decorated incongruously with Hubba Bubba wrappers, behind one force or another. Ultimately, it will be they who determine the future of Afghanistan. Last spring, I was hanging out with some boys in Mazar-e-Sharif. They were, if we were to believe the old trope, they are the future of Afghanistan. My friends were all working boys. There were child welders, child auto mechanics, child cement haulers, child shredders of carrots for somebody's rice pilau, They were maybe 7, 9, 10 years old, and all of them were malnourished, so they seemed much younger than they are because they were smaller. But up close, they looked like old men. They had these worry wrinkles across their foreheads, and they had these skeptical down curves of their mouths, these eyes suspicious of life, eyes of men who have already seen everything and know there is no more coming. They are supposed to determine the future of Afghanistan, but these children look like men who know they have none. Or will the future of Afghanistan be determined by a single event, an event that took place this year? And no, I'm not talking about the discovery of $1 trillion worth of lithium in the Afghan countryside, which, by the way, begs the question, shouldn't we just have no problems in Afghanistan anymore? Shouldn't we just have all these entrenched fighters lick the sand from time to time? Peace should be breaking out all over the place. Lithium. The event I am talking about is the enacting in March of a statute called the National Stability and Reconciliation Law. The law grants amnesty to warlords responsible for human rights abuses in the preceding decades. It is an expression of gratitude by President Hamid Karzai, who depends on warlords to stay in power, and by the international community, which has relied on warlords since 2001 in order to fight what it sees as the greater evil, the Taliban. The National Stability and Reconciliation Law. The title at first glance seems a tragic misnomer, or maybe a cynical joke. But it reflects very eloquently the trade-off the world has made by reconciling itself to an Afghanistan run by warlords in the name of containing a Taliban insurgency. Talk about your myopia. The world should have sat down for dinner with the Pashtun women from the northern Afghan village of Kulambo and listened to their stories. In 2001, after helping expel the Taliban from northern Afghanistan, the victorious militia of the ethnic Hazara warlord Mohammad Muhakkek whooped through Kulambo. In pickup trucks and on foot, the fighters spilled from the center of the village and spread through narrow, crooked clay streets. They corralled all the livestock they could find and tossed some into the flatbeds of their trucks and shot the rest. Then they corralled all the men they could find and shot them. Then they entered the houses where the women and children were crouching beneath the dun hemispheres of hand-slapped roofs. I asked the women what happened then. They touched all the women and the teenage girls, one told me. Another said, in my father's house, they gathered all the women in one room. And the third said, women and girls are ashamed to talk about what happened then. Afghanistan's warlords come from every dominant ethnic group. No ethnic group has been spared the atrocities of the others in the eternal war of attrition that has pitted Uzbeks against Tajiks, Pashtuns against Hazaras, Tajiks against Turkmen. Now, thanks to the National Stability and Reconciliation Law, these war criminals will never be punished. In fact, most of the candidates who ran for the lower house of Afghan parliament in September, and we're yet to see how that turns out, were associated with Afghanistan's numerous warlords and their militias. Who is to say that the crimes they committed a decade or two ago will not repeat itself tomorrow? Afghans bear grudges like badges of honor. I met this one man, a Pashtun, who told me how his brother was killed by Hazara gunmen at 4 o'clock on a Thursday 15 years ago. That's some memory. If we take a trip a little farther down memory lane, we'll remember that the presence of Pashtuns in northern Afghanistan is itself the product of a 120-year-old state-sanctioned ethnic cleansing of Hazara, the Shia Muslim minority who are believed to have descended from the armies of Genghis Khan and traditionally shunned by most other Afghans. As part of an anti-Shia jihad, as he called it, the Afghan king at the time, Abdur Rahman, whom they also call the Iron Emir, forcibly settled 10,000 Pashtun families north of the Hindu Kush in the 1890s. Today, the resurgent Taliban is finding a foothold in the pockets of Pashtun settlements across northern Afghanistan that date back to that forced migration. Fear of ethnic violence is one of the reasons that Pashtuns in the north, which the West had once believed was immune to the Taliban, embraced the return of the militia. The man with the brother who was killed 15 years ago on a Thursday, the women of Kulambo, they think only a Taliban government can protect them, and we need to listen to their stories. Another group that is embracing the Taliban in the north are returning refugees. Thousands of families that had fled Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion have been coming back at the invitation of the Afghan government. But the Afghan government has nothing to offer them when they return. It resettles them in infertile deserts in spots so remote the nearest jobs are a walk's day away, with no access to health care. And if the Afghan government can't offer jobs to these refugees, what kind of jobs will it offer to the Taliban fighters it is trying to entice? The more you listen to these stories of the people from the edges of the world, the more questions you have. And some of these questions are very uncomfortable. In Afghanistan, the answers to these questions may determine the course of the war and the longer-term future of the region. So we should keep asking them. We should keep listening to the stories Afghans tell when they break bread. And on their behalf, I thank you today for listening.
This was really very moving and extremely kind of timely, obviously, with the war going on in Afghanistan and the difficult questions we're facing. There's going to be a kind of mid-year review coming up in December on how things are going, what are the metrics of success, especially since we have a deadline of July 2011 for exit and whether that's realistic or not.
But the beginning of an exit.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's exactly what the military says. It's the beginning of the exit, and the civilians see it very differently. But for today's conversation, I wanted to actually make sure that the whole kind of breadth and depth of your book comes to light, because this book is not just about Afghanistan. It's a book that I kind of had to devour because I couldn't put down, and I still was craving more at the end of it. It's a book that comes out of 10 years of reporting, basically, and it's 10 years of reporting in very difficult places across the globe. So it's Afghanistan, it's Iraq, it's Kenya, it's Chechnya, Russia, Tajikistan, and I'm sure I'm leaving some places out. It's just truly fascinating how Anna has managed to show us the connections across the globe and across these war zones, and how everything comes together in a very elemental way, and that's, you know, around the meal and around eating. What's really wonderful about the book is not only is there a captivating story about a place, and the story takes you there, you kind of like smell the food, taste the food, feel what the characters are feeling, but it also ends with recipes.
So really, when you said you devoured the book, that's what you meant? You cooked
No, actually I didn't. I wish I had the time. I haven't had the time to try any of them. But I do intend to get kind of going on that, especially since some of them are alternative recipes of things that I've kind of grown up eating. So it's very, very exciting. And what I liked about Anna's book is it also shows you that, you know, we always associate war zones with depravity, starving people, miserable people, conditions that are very difficult. And Anna tells us that that's correct. You know, these are difficult conditions, but people become very creative about what one could make out of what they have, and they're also always extremely generous in terms of sharing, which was something that was extremely beautiful to see. And I never associated war zones with appetizers, main dishes, and desserts, but there's all there. This is a book that has all the meals, which is very exciting. I mean, and I was even writing it down. I was like, appetizers, you know, zakuski, meze, which is basically kind of I'm being pleonastic here because these are terms in different languages that basically mean that. And then, you know, the different main dishes, and then baklava for dessert, and it was just very, very movingly done. What I wanted to kind of probe you was, can you tell us, were the recipes motivating the book, or were the stories and then the recipes? Tell us a little bit more about how you decided to do this and why, because as I said, it's 10 years of reporting coming together. So,
well, how do you put the Bush decade into a way that we can all relate to? Yeah. You can sit down for a meal and discuss it over dinner. So that's what I tried to do. I tried to invite all the people I've met well, not all, but all the people, most of the people who made a very deep impression on me over the last 10 years, reporting across the globe, to a dinner table with whoever happens to pick up the book and talk on a very human level about what it is like, what it was like to survive this decade. And so, yes, there are stories from Afghanistan and Iraq and Israel and Gaza and the West Bank and Russia and Chechnya. No dishes from Chechnya, Kenya. You know, there are some meals in the book that, for me, are so closely associated with the people who introduced me to these meals that I cannot think about anything else when I'm eating or making or preparing that food. And you know, each time I cook dolma, for example, the grape leaves, the stuffed grape leaves, I think of a wonderful Iraqi reporter, a very brave writer I met in 2003, Ahmad, who's in chapter 1. He's the first chapter. Because his wife and daughters showed me how to make dolma in 2003 while U.S. planes were bombing their hometown, and they were refugees at the time in a part of Iraq, in Kurdistan, northern Iraq, that wasn't being bombed. So, you know, recipes were not an afterthought. They were a dessert, if you will, to the chapters. The chapters are really an attempt to bring the human, to bring out the human, the humanity in us to the table, so to speak, and to share that, because tremendous humanity exists in every one of us, and it seems to me that the more barren your circumstances, the more stripped down your house, the more stripped down your kitchen, the more the emptiness is filled with extraordinary humanity and generosity. You know, here we have all these walls and gates, and I have a burglar alarm in my house. But in places I travel, there are often not even doors. So you just walk in. And as soon as you walk in, you become a guest. And the host will share with you whatever he has or whatever she has and tell you their story. And that is how you learn about what people really are thinking about, what is important.
Also, I mean, I'm going to ask you about your favorite recipe, so prepare your answer to that. That's going to be a tough one. Because a lot of those sound delicious. But the other thing that I really liked about this book was that Anna manages to give us a sense of the macro narrative of the conflicts through basically individual stories. So she gives us a sense of, you know, the main cleavage, why people may be fighting for, but how that resonates with the individual, his family, his sons and daughters, his neighbors. So that I also appreciated very much and found it very powerful. The other thing I really liked, and Anna hasn't alluded to that yet, but maybe it will come in a bit, a lot of the personal stories from Russia. We don't necessarily think of Russia as a war zone, but Anna showed us what it meant to be growing up kind of in the Soviet Union and how there was some sort of created constraints because of the regime. So it may not have been a war zone, but there were all these things you couldn't get or buy or have because of the way the market operated. So it was nice to see a little back and forth from kind of the personal experiences growing up in the Soviet Union and how they may have related to being in the war zones and memories they would bring back. But I also really liked the Borscht story. And I was hoping you could talk about that before you go and tell us about your favorite recipe, just because that one I found phenomenally engaging. And maybe you can give a kind of a broader context of why that's relevant.
I think that, first of all, I have to make a correction. I think that Russia is a war zone, and the Soviet Union was definitely a war zone. It was a country at war with itself, and it definitely still very much is. It is a country where the government considers the people who populate the country expendable, and that is willing to sacrifice these people in order to stay in power. And this is probably the way Russian governments have operated for centuries. But most recently, the Soviet Union, you know, we were always, the slogans we had growing up were always the fight. We were fighting. We were still fighting to get to communism. We were fighting against the subversive bourgeoisie who were somehow among us and therefore probably were us, some of us maybe were them, the enemy. And then today, well, first of all, Russia is at war. It is at war in the North Caucasus, and not anymore just in Chechnya, but all over the North Caucasus. You know, the millions of people who live there are today expendable. The Borscht chapter is about an event that you probably remember. Some of you, in 2002, a group of Chechen terrorists took hostage a theater in Moscow, about 3 miles from the Kremlin, in the evening, full of spectators. About 800 people were in the audience, and you know, I think that the numbers included the staff and the actors. The hostage crisis lasted about 3 days, at the end of which the Kremlin pumped in poisonous gas into the theater, put everybody to sleep. Then Russian commandos barged in, shot all the Chechen terrorists. So we'll never know how they got there for sure, because they were all dead. And then dragged out the heavily drugged hostages. The Chechens during the hostage crisis killed 1, maybe 2 hostages. Their accounts differ. 129 people, I believe, were killed by Russian authorities who pumped poison gas, did not tell the doctors which gas they used. So when the doctors received, you know, doctors were expecting to do triage. They were expecting gunshot wounds or, you know, shrapnel wounds. Instead, they're getting hundreds of poisoned people, and they don't know what the poison is. So they scramble to figure out how to treat people from. They didn't even know what to treat them from. You know, you were listening to the radio, you're listening to the death toll, 60 people, then an hour later 70 people, then 90 people. It was cold, it was November, it was wet, it had been raining for 3 days, or it seemed as though it had been. It seemed as though it had been completely dark and raining all the time. And we were just standing vigil outside the theater throughout the crisis. And then after it was over, and we wrote our stories, and we went to a Ukrainian place and ordered borscht, hot, very, very savory, very filling, traditional Russian dish. It's a soup made with beets, and there's lots of meat in there, and you know, fat, probably really bad for you. Sour cream. The more, you know, the more fatty stuff, the better. Hot, and it was the meal that every Russian, anybody who grew up in the Soviet Union, and I shouldn't say Russian, anybody who grew up in the Soviet Union knew borscht as the big meal that you cook once a week, and you cook a giant pot of it, and it's you come in from the cold, you eat that. It's the comfort food. It's the ultimate comfort food. You know, it's the donuts. So we went for that. We went for the Russian donuts. We went for the borscht. A meal that you can order at any restaurant in Russia. They will all serve it differently. They will all cook it differently. But it will have the same meaning, something hot, something to protect you, something to protect you from the cold, and from the cold, both physical cold, but also the cold of living in that country that doesn't care.
I mean, I appreciated the whole need for fat to get to feel better about what was going on. Looking through the book, a lot of these recipes were kind of on the heavy side, and they felt like comfort food recipes, which made them even better. And even
actually, I skipped all the lard. Most of them,
which makes them even more delicious. But I wanted to probe you kind of on the more general story, and then I'll come down again and ask you some more specifics. But can you give us a sense of how you decided how to structure the book? Because it's not strictly chronological. You kind of start with Iraq, end with Iraq, Afghanistan thrown in there as well, but then all these other places. How did you decide what goes first? What kind of motivated the structure of the book?
I actually think it is mostly chronological. It's bracketed by two stories of very important and dear friendships I made in Iraq, both in Iraq. One introduces Ahmad, my translator, journalist, writer friend, who worked with me in 2003, and the last chapter introduces two women who worked with me also that year as translators, Iraqi women as well. But in between, it goes chronologically. So it starts with my first big mechanized war, Afghanistan, in 2001, and then segues into, I guess, chronologically would be Israel and the Palestinian territories, and then Chechnya, and then Kenya. I was actually covering Somalia at the time, but Kenya got in the book and Somalia did not. I think because in Somalia I was traveling with, I was staying with Doctors Without Borders, and they were so homesick for normalcy that they hired these amazing Somali cooks who had, Somalia used to be an Italian colony at the time, so these cooks, the Somalis used to work for the Italian consulates or embassies, and so they cooked European food. And imagine this, you are in the middle of a country that hasn't had a central government since 1991. It is basically a collection of kingdoms. Sometimes the kingdoms, the borders are guarded by 10-year-olds with Kalashnikovs. The mortality rates are extraordinary from preventable diseases, and these doctors are trying to save, babies who have TB and heart diseases, and just incredible destitution and devastation of that place. And then you come after 12 hours of that, and you sit down around the table and you have lasagna, or and a fresh salad with a Greek salad. So not very creative there with the food, but it shows us how food is important and what food does to us, what food means to us. And so yes, it is all comfort food, because in a war zone, every meal had better be a comfort food, because it might be your last.
So, I appreciated the whole kind of lasagna in Somalia, because it makes me think of the burgers and lobster in Tikrit, which is another one of your stories. And basically it shows the degree of pleasure and kind of normalcy our forces get by eating, American food in Iraq, and what it means to have mac and cheese and burgers and, those lobster tails once in a while. So I was wondering if you could give us a sense of what motivated that story. And it wasn't a story about ready-made meals, even though those could be exciting too. It was more a story about, what you could eat that would make you think of home.
Lobster tails are decidedly not comfort food, by the way, because you get the lobster tails, first of all.
Unless you're from Maine.
Well, I made sure that I ate lobster tails every time they served them, simply because I wanted to eat my, a year worth of my taxes. I can't even imagine how much that stuff costs. To bring in it from Maine and then to convoy it up the peninsula from Kuwait in trucks. The military call them derogatory. They're with sort of a derogatory expression. They call them the cheese convoys. But in fact, these were the main targets of all those roadside bombs, the convoys, civilian contractors who drove these trucks with expensive food. And then they start, just to make sure they're properly cooked, they start boiling them at breakfast to serve for dinner. And of course then you get that rubbery tail, and then you have to somehow peel it out of the shell with the plastic silverware that you get in a military base. So it's all very complicated and decidedly not comforting. However, I spent some time embedded with American troops in Iraq, and I met this battalion commander in Tikrit, which was the city near the village where Saddam Hussein was born. In 2005, he was in charge of 900 men, 900 American troops, I should say, and an area that was a breeding ground for a Sunni insurgency, an area where it was unclear whom you could trust and whom you couldn't trust, an area where any given day you would go out on patrol and maybe you will meet a father with a child who needed medical attention, or maybe you would meet an insurgent sniper who would shoot your buddy. And just the utter lack of control, even though nominally we were controlling that territory, the utter lack of control that the battalion commander experienced as the man in charge of that area. You know, he needed to protect his men, he needed to protect the civilians, he needed to fight the insurgents, he needed to build the government, he needed to build up Iraqi forces. The only thing it seemed that he could control was what he had for dinner. So every day he would go into the, they call them chow halls, the mess hall, the dining hall, the dining facility at the military base. And dining facilities at American military bases, they sort of, the bigger the base, the bigger and more fancy the dining facility. They reminded me of actually of college cafeteria a lot, because they, you know, you could get all sorts of stuff, lobster tails, for example. Do you get lobster tails here at MIT? Well then, think about your career move. So anyway, he would go in, and regardless of what was on the menu, and the guy's from Iowa, so regardless, they have corn dog eating competitions in Iowa, for those of you who are not from Iowa. Every day he would order, he would pick up, put on his plate a burger, corn dog, some French fries, and Jell-O, regardless of what else, you know, chicken jambalaya, you know, steak, lobster. No, he had the same meal every day, because I think he knew that every meal could be his last, because he knew that that was the only thing that he could know for sure will be there. He knew that if the day ends with him alive and he gets to go to the dining facility, there will be the corn dog, which reminded him of home.
The power of the corn dog.
No recipe for corn dog there. I drew the line at, you know, batter.
Yeah, no, it's pretty good. Reading this book actually also made me think of another book by a friend. I'm sure you must be familiar with it. It's called The Places in Between by Rory Stewart.
Rory Stewart, a wonderful book.
Yeah, that's basically kind of a travelogue also, and it's a walk through Afghanistan from all the way from the west in the city of Herat to Kabul. And it was in the winter right after the fall of the Taliban. So it's late 2001 or early 2002. And what's interesting about that book is he also speaks about the generosity of the locals and the fact that they were willing to offer him shelter and food. But he also goes into detail about his bowel movements and how not all of that food sat very well in his stomach.
Yeah, but he's British, you know.
So I was wondering, and actually I felt the pain as well. I mean, I've survived very different types of salmonella poisoning throughout my trips.
I was actually in a coma after one of my Afghan trips, but I don't put that in the book.
Yeah, I
know. You don't need to know that.
I know.
I need you to work up your appetite.
So I was wondering to what degree there was also suffering in some of those delightful meals. Unintended, of course. There's no intention on the part of the hosts to poison you in any way. But it just shows that things that, you know, they have to survive on may not always be the right thing for us. So I was wondering if you could share a couple of those stories just to spice things up.
Well, I'm not going to go that far. I was in Afghanistan. My last trip was in the spring, and I went to a pediatric ward in Mazar-e-Sharif, and it was almost empty. There was only one bed in the pediatric ward where 2 children and their mothers were put on the same bed. And all the other beds were full, but only 1 child plus mother. And the doctors explained to me that this was the in-between season. In the winter, they get 3 to 4 children per cot, plus mothers, because it gets cold, the kids get sick, their parents either don't recognize the illness right away or figure that their kids will get over it, and so don't bring them to the hospital. And then by the time they bring them to the hospital, it very often is too late. But anyway, the hospital is completely crowded in the winter. And then the summer season, which basically dysentery takes over Afghanistan. So I'm not sure that saying that they can eat it and we can't is actually correct, because nobody can live like that, should live like that. People do. But the dysentery that you and I have both suffered from, and all of my colleagues, Afghans suffer from as well, we get to tell the stories. And they very often don't live to tell the stories because there is inadequate medical attention, there is no health care, there is no recognition of being sick. A mother with 13 children may not notice that one of them has developed diarrhea. And by the time she does, it's too late. The child is dying of dehydration.
So yeah, I just felt that this story needed to be told along with the more tasty stories in the book. You didn't tell us about your favorite recipe. Is there one?
They're all favorite. Well, okay, so for fun, I think the best recipe in the book, and every single one of you, regardless of how agile you are in the kitchen, can make this. It's a very common, Elizabeth will confirm, it's a very common vodka chaser in Russia. It's called the onion. You take the onion, you peel it. Do you know how to peel an onion? You peel the onion, you divide it into 4 quarters, and voila, you have that. It's very low calorie, too. Don't go on a date after that. The onion vodka breath combo, it's pretty deadly. I love dalma, the recipe that follows the first chapter. It's a great communal dish. It takes a while to prepare, but it's monotonous, and it's a great meal to prepare together with somebody, maybe as a group of people. Makes the job go faster, and also you can have a conversation while you're sort of rolling and wrapping. And it reminds me of my good friend, the Iraqi journalist and writer Ahmad Shawkat. So that I cook that for big occasions when we have a lot of guests. But there are recipes in there like the meze, the pan-Mediterranean, I guess, but definitely pan-Middle Eastern appetizers. The hummus, the tabbouleh, the fattoush salad. That's what we eat every day at home. That's what my kids know how to make it. That's what we have. So that and rice, and then either some lamb or some fish. That's our diet.
The Mediterranean diet. I mean, it's proven. Proven to be
proven
really
something.
good and tasty, I guess. So my other kind of question reading the book was what I appreciated, I guess, about it was even though it was a book about food, it's not just about women. Because, in a lot of the Western contexts, you associate food with, or even in the Eastern, of being cooked by women. But the nice thing about Anna is she's a Western woman, so she can be both with the men and with the women. She's kind of the third sex in the book. Mm-hmm. So I was hoping maybe you could also tell us the story of Afghanistan in the first time around, and where you had young boys serving the food, and how women were kind of invisible because you were there with male colleagues. Kind of give us a sense of the role of the way the family is understood and run when guests are present.
Even when guests are not present very often in traditional Afghan family, the women will make the food, and then the men and the children will eat the food, and then the women will eat what's left over. And so this was the case in some of the families with whom I ate. But in restaurants, women don't cook the food because women can't work in most of the traditional parts of Afghanistan. So anything you eat outside the house, anything you eat in the street or in a restaurant will be prepared by a man. It's counterintuitively, I guess, or maybe not, since, if you think about 50, 100 years ago, and even today, most of the important restaurant chefs, especially in Europe, are male. But women are sort of very often shadows. And actually, it was not always easy for me to talk to women because most of my translators were male. So I can be a woman, and if I spoke the language, I would be able to go from the male part of the house, where I'm allowed, because I'm just so weird and hard to classify as anything, that it's okay for me to be with the men, to the female half of the house. And I can do that, but I can't do that with a translator, because the translator, being a male who's not related to the women, wouldn't be allowed into the female part of the house. And actually, on a trip last May, I went to a village, a Turkoman, ethnic Turkoman village in northern Afghanistan, where women weave carpets. And the women refused to answer my questions because I had to ask them through the translator. They just ignored him completely. And so then we figured out a way. We asked the question of one of the husbands of one of the women. He asked his wife. She responded to him, and then we could overhear. It's very complicated. It's all. I had a translator once who refused to talk to me, even though he did not refuse to take his paycheck from me. So it was kind of a, there was not a whole lot of, there was like a lot of take, but not a lot of give. And he got fired because it was getting tricky. He would translate my questions, but when I would to other people, but when I would ask him what he thought, I swear he just pursed his lips tighter together just to make sure no word was uttered from his lips to me. And I don't know why. I don't know why. Maybe he thought it inappropriate to talk to me. I was traveling with David Filipov. We were dating at the time. We were later to become husband and wife. He may have thought that it would be inappropriate and an insult to my man for him to talk to me. So it could have been that he just, wanted to make sure that David was happy. It's possible that he thought it was beneath his dignity, or it's possible that he thought it was beneath my dignity to be talking to him, a strange man. So it's, who knows? I would have asked, but he wouldn't have answered.
What I really appreciated also was the way David makes it into the book. And he makes it as, he apparently is the look-alike of Bulbul Afghan, basically the Afghan Elvis.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could give us a bit of that story. I thought it was very funny. So kind of a sense of how it was to be traveling with a star.
Well, imagine going to Memphis, not with an Elvis impersonator, but with Elvis now. Ahmad Zair was the Elvis Presley of Afghanistan, who died in the 70s in a car crash. Although some say that there was a woman involved, and some say that there was politics involved, and some say both. Anyway, he's long dead, and everybody knows that. Yet he continues to be immensely popular. And David apparently looked like him at the time. Maybe the photographs were grainy. But
actually, I looked him up, and he did look like
he
that.
Did,
yeah, especially the hair.
Yeah,
I couldn't resist.
It was, sometimes it was great because we got great access. People would just say, "Ahmed, is that you?" And David would say, "Of course." And then
I hope they didn't ask him to sing.
He would have. And sometimes it created dangerous situations, like the time we were trying to be very low-key in a town that had been liberated from the Taliban maybe 3 or 4 days ago, a bit earlier, and we showed up, and we got out of the car, and immediately, Ahmad, is that you? And then there's a crowd, and we're no longer incognito, and everybody knows that there is a Westerner who looks exactly like Ahmad Zair in town. So yes, it was interesting.
So I think I'll leave it at that and get some questions from the audience, because I'm sure you've had enough with me interrogating Anna. It would be great to hear what you have to ask.
A curiosity question. How did you get into that business? Did you study journalism, and who supported you over there? How did you manage finances in all those travels?
I actually never studied journalism. I owe my career to 2 very insightful editors at the St. Petersburg Times of Russia, which was my first job at a newspaper. I was hired to be a secretary. it took them 2 days to understand that I could not be a secretary because I was unable to transfer a single phone call in a newspaper, in a newsroom with a staff of 6 without messing it up. So they said, well, what do you do with somebody who can't do that? And, well, okay, can you write? Can you, so yes, I never studied journalism, and then I started writing stories, and I was freelancing for the San Francisco Chronicle in 2001 when the war in Afghanistan began. And they asked me to go to Afghanistan, and I did, and then they hired me as a staff writer, and I worked for them until 2007. I worked a little bit for the Boston Globe, and then I went back to freelancing because a number of news organizations in the States that have international postings has begun to shrunk and now is almost non-existent. Very few papers have staff writers who go overseas, and that's what I do. I travel to conflict zones and to extremities of the world to tell these stories because I think they're important. So freelancing is what I do. I sometimes get grants to do my work, and sometimes I just write a lot of stories. But if that's the career you're contemplating, I think it would be wonderful. We need more voices. It's not a moneymaker.
Hi, my name is Lawrence Perlman. I lived in Africa for a while and also worked for the UN for 1 year. And I guess my question is, a lot of times the stuff we hear out of Afghanistan and Iraq is really just militarily. It's very much the army did this, and and that's kind of where the focus on Western influence is in those places. But especially because I happen to work with food when I was working for the UN, I'm curious to know in their books about food. Where do you feel the humanitarian or the NGOs and the kind of third-party Western institutions and organizations are in these conflict zones? I mean, how much do they help? Have you seen them be effective? Because there is a bit of a debate about how involved they are and they should be. And that story about Médecins Sans Frontières was kind of hit home a little bit. And if you could just expand on that, I'd appreciate it.
I think it varies. There was a very interesting piece by Peter Bergen in the New Republic in the summer in which he demonstrated that of every $100 of international aid spent on Afghanistan, $20 is actually spent on aid in Afghanistan, and the rest goes on paychecks, bodyguards, armored cars, et cetera, et cetera. And what I saw on my last trip to Afghanistan, I would say very ineffective and depressingly so, devastatingly so. But I think it varies from one area to another. In Somalia, NGOs sometimes are the only, provide the only health care, for example, or the only source of nutrition. But they also perpetuate warlordism because everywhere they work, they have to hire bodyguards, and the bodyguards essentially belong to a warlord, so they're paying the warlord, and they're very well aware of this aspect of their presence there, but they perpetuate the war by financing the warlord. Without the bodyguards, these very bodyguards would become robbers of the very same organization. So you have to, in order to operate, so there is always a trade-off that goes on. You have to figure out which is the lesser of two evils. So it's hard to say. I think that of course it's important to bring international aid to war-torn places or places that are devastated by failed states or places that had suffered from natural disasters. I'm not an expert, so I don't know whether it can be done more, or rather how it can be done more efficiently. In Afghanistan, it seems to not be working very well for a number of reasons. The kleptocracy that runs the country probably takes a lot of the money that we send as the world, skims it. And the general danger of traveling through Afghanistan. I spoke to a UN worker, a Western, I guess, UN worker, who said that she could not travel to a couple of the provinces where she's supposed to be overseeing projects because it's too dangerous.
I've always wondered how the children survive, how they grow up in these war-torn areas. And I remember seeing an article years ago that said that where children in wars have had strong parental love and support, it mitigates a little bit the fear that comes with seeing the bombs and so on. And I was wondering if you have stories about food and families, and it sounds to me a lot, I haven't seen the book yet, but a lot of what you're doing is trying to say that normalcy, and I'm wondering to what extent it works. I mean, the children that you were hanging out with, it sounds like they're still very, very worried. Just curious about trying to bring that human part of the story, since we don't hear it in the U.S., since we only hear the military side.
I don't know. I haven't seen the statistics for recently, but I remember that 5 or 6 years ago, 70 or 80% of Afghans were estimated to have post-traumatic stress disorder. So you can have the protection of your family, even if you have a very somehow successful family, you still are experiencing loss and poverty. Poverty is a giant source of post-traumatic stress in a country that has no stability. And this is not unique to Afghanistan. This is in all the failed states and all the countries that have been torn apart by war for a long time. So you see people who are traumatized from birth. And in Iraq, which is a conflict I covered a lot, I started going there in 2003 and basically kept going. And I watched kids grow up. And kids who were 9 in 2003, now they are, 16? Now they're almost adults, and they carry so much hatred and so much mistrust toward each other. And those are going to be wounds that are going to be very, very difficult to heal, I think. Yes, I'm sorry, you were...
I wanted maybe to pick up on the first subject you introduced, the new law in Afghanistan, according to which all the crimes were forgiven to the old warlords. I mean, an alliance was made with the less hostile of the two foes. What do you think will happen next? I mean, we don't know, and the medias are obviously...
I'm sorry, what do I think will happen next with what?
Next, following this law, what do you think will happen once the government will fall into the hands again of the warlords, where it was before the Taliban's?
Well, first of all, let's make a correction here. The government is in the hands of the warlords. What happened was that now the people who may have thought that at one point they will get some sort of restitution, or the warlords whose militias had perpetrated crimes against them would be punished, now they know for sure that they won't be punished. So what that creates is a sense of that the government doesn't care about the victims, and that the international community doesn't care about the victims. And so the victims are basically saying, well, now we have to take matters into our own hands. And I think that creates definitely an opening for an insurgency, which can say, well, the government can't protect you and doesn't care about you, and neither does the international community. We can protect you and care about you. Whom would you support? You know, it's sort of like a very simple mechanism for insurgents to gather popular support. But what it does, in my opinion, what it does in the larger picture is that it just perpetuates the problem that Afghanistan has had since time immemorial, which is it's not a united country. There is no government that loves all of its people equally. It's selective in the way it treats its people, and it's very segregated, ethnically segregated, especially in the parts that are not homogenous, like the south, which is mostly Pashtun. But the central Afghanistan, northern Afghanistan, which is, there are pockets of Pashtuns and pockets of Uzbeks and Tajiks and Hazara and Turkmen, and smaller groups that, may be small, but they're just as important. What it basically says is these genocidal and fratricidal campaigns that have always ravaged Afghanistan will continue, and there is no hope, and there will not be any punishment.
Thanks for everything. I guess my question is, I'm sure you've seen a lot, and I'm curious how you handle your emotions. Despite all the sufferings that you see, you still seem to maintain such composure. And I was wondering how you're capable of doing that. When you see a lot of things with your own eyes, how do you, be detached in a way and observe it without getting too involved in it emotionally? Does that make sense?
Well, writing is very therapeutic, and I was not going to throw anything at you. It was a joke. Writing is therapeutic, so I write stories, and it's hard, yeah. But I don't know if it helps that I'm not the only person for whom it's hard. It's probably harder for people whom I leave behind. But yesterday I got a very sad message on Facebook. It's great, we're living in the 21st century. People communicate through Facebook. I got a message on Facebook from the family in whose house I stayed last spring that my host father died. He died of cancer. He had blood cancer, and he could have died of cancer anywhere in the world. And he didn't have to be in a war zone. And they were a pretty well-off family. They took him to Pakistan. They showed him to a German doctor. He had no hope of surviving. But it still was very sad for me, because this was a man who kept me safe and kept me fed and risked his life, because if anybody had found out that he was keeping a Western reporter in his house, he would have had serious trouble. And it was very sad to talk to my friends, to his family. He had 13 children, I don't know how many grandchildren, a couple dozen. The sadness that we would all feel if our patriarch died, or our grandfather, and I thought, well, isn't that enough? Isn't it enough to just have people who die of old age or of diseases that cannot today be prevented? Why do we need to also have the danger that one of his grandchildren may be riding, a bicycle down the street and get his leg blown off by a bomb? So, you think about people in war zones don't just die because they get killed. They also die of things we all die of, if we're lucky. There's this additional grief, additional layer of grief that follows living in conflict zones. I guess that goes back to the question Elizabeth had earlier about whether the family can keep you sane. It can to a certain extent, but you still feel pain.
Anybody else? Don't be shy. I asked all these non-stop questions, so. Any ideas on recipes that should have been in the book and didn't make it?
Well, you know, the whole book could have been recipes. I thought at one point, many years ago, when I thought first of you know, I was, where was I? I was in Baghdad in 2003, right after the shock and awe section of the campaign, and then it just became awe. It was, I had filed my story, and I was staying at a hotel, and I went downstairs to the restaurant, and I ordered really, really bad chicken tikka. It's like chicken kebab, but it was overcooked, and I thought, you know, there was gunfire outside behind the walls, and I thought, here I am, you know, eating in a restaurant in a hotel after a horrendous day, and there are people killing each other outside, and we all somehow need to eat and find the time and find a state of mind to calm down enough to sit down for a meal and criticize it. You know, damn, this chicken really is bad today and every day. And, you know, fire the chef while a war is breaking out outside that will last who knows how long. You know, it's still, you know, Washington may have turned the page, but the Iraqis certainly have not. So it's amazing how much we're trying to survive. Our bodies they just, you know, need to persevere and feed it themselves and put fuel inside. And sometimes our taste buds even kick in and say, this chicken is bad. Give me something else.
I guess we'll just leave it with a bad chicken. Unless, Anna, you have some closing remarks. As I said, this is a remarkable book. I kept on thinking how it would make the most fabulous gift for the holidays. I have all these women that I think are going to love this. But also I'm sending it strategically to men who don't think it's manly for them to cook, but given that it's associated with war stories, I'm trying to give them a sense of how there is a lot of manliness in cooking. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
This was truly lovely, and all the best. Anna is working on a new project as well, so maybe she can give us an overview on that, which brings her again to war zones. She just mentioned that.
The next book will be about art, and I will write it from Afghanistan.
So again, moving from food to art, we won't be complaining. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.